يا رب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. After you stay, okay. So this is the not the final lecture in this series in this course, but it's the one before the end. So next week we'll run the last one, inshallah ta'ala, and then we'll call it a day for this semester. It will be 8 lectures in total, and the exam for this is going to be a reflective piece, so it's going to be a pass and good marks for everybody. And then after that, inshallah, the course will become a little bit more serious once we go into if you notice, we're not going to really cover much of his life, alayhi salatu wasalam, in this part of the course, as I'm really just very interested in drawing the best visual picture I can for you about what the world looked like when he came to it, alayhi salatu wasalam. Because if you can understand that well, then you can really appreciate the challenges he was up against and what he was able to maintain for himself as a young person, and then what he was fighting, or he was swimming against the current during his prophecy, alayhi salatu wasalam, clearly, a bit more clearly. And I think it's just helpful because the Quran, the language of the Quran, and the nature of the challenges that the Quran talks about are very much related to this to the content that I'm sharing with you here. And as boring as sometimes some of these topics may be, like the genealogy piece, and it just they matter a lot. Like it's the context that you need to know in order for the Quran to make more sense to you. And at least I found this when I was studying, and we didn't study it in the method that I'm teaching it to you today, but rather we studied it through years of studying Arabic poetry. Honestly, a lot of it, and Tarikh al-Adab al-Arabi, for example, the history of Arabic literature. And when you study a lot of that, and you read, and we had to read Al-Kamil al-Mubarrid, and we had to read like the majority of Al-Aghani al-Asfahani. And these are books that are not religiously, like the people who wrote them were religious imams, but they didn't write it with the intention of trying to spread da'wah. It was just they're just huge collections of stories of things that happened before his life, alayhi salam, and afterwards as well. So when you study those pieces, the Jahili pieces, you learn a lot about the mentality of the people. And then you can connect a little bit more to, okay, that's why this is happening, or that's why the Quran is talking about this. It makes more sense. All right. So what I'm going to do today, talk to you a little bit about the small aspects of Arabian culture. I'm not going to go too much detail, just a few things. They cared a lot about these things. Tents were a big deal. I just realized this now. I should have probably not done that. All right. Whoever's watching this a couple of years from now won't get the joke, but Allahu Akbar. Can't believe I forgot that I put this in. I should have probably removed it. Anyways. Tents were a big deal. That's where they lived. And they used a lot of the descriptions, the words that they used to describe tents, to describe their daily activities. And it was just a part of their, it was a very strong part of their culture, because you can imagine someone who nomads, they move around a lot. So you had to be ready to set up a tent and then bring it down in a way that you don't ruin it, because you're going to set it up again, and that's where you're going to live. It's going to protect you from the extremely cold desert nights and the extremely hot desert days and all the wind and all the animals that come through. So tents were meaningful to them. Their homes, it was their homes, and it functioned to them in a certain way. Camels and horses and gazelles and animals in general, they cared about these things. So when you read Arabic poetry and Arabic literature, you find that they use a lot of these similes in ways that if you listen to them today, like today I say ahmar, and that's immediately something that's negative, right? Not back then, not at all. The Prophet ﷺ had a himar, and he named him. Like he had a himar alayhi salam. He had a jahsh, a mule that he named. He had a baghl. He called him duldul. He gave him all these funny names. The Prophet ﷺ actually cared about his animals, and people were named after animals. The Prophet ﷺ's grandfather is Qusay ibn Kilab. Kilab is the plural of dog. So the man's name is literally dogs. That's his name. This is why he carried that name with him. There's nothing negative about it. Dogs in Islam, unfortunately, we misunderstand the ruling of the Prophet ﷺ in Islam in terms of impurity, and we think it's something. We think they're evil, or they're animals that are bad. No. The Arab did not see dogs to be like that, nor did he, alayhi salatu wasalam. They had dogs that protect their farms and protect their homes. It's just they recognize that these are animals that eat their own feces and others' feces, so maybe don't let them slobber all over you because it's not clean. So it's just an issue of cleanliness, not really an issue of whether they're worthy creatures or not. So they had this connection towards animals, and when you find them describing each other, like Abdullah ibn Jahsh, for example, his father was named Jahsh, which is a mule. And today, like every time I say it, I can see a few people who smile and grin because they find it absolutely hilarious that the guy's name is Jahsh. And I always asked my teacher, like, what do we do with this? Like, I want to tell the guy's story. Can I maybe just skip his dad's name and goes to his grandfather? And he said, "A'udhu billah." You will use his dad's name. You'll have to learn. But this is not an obscenity or a bad word. It's just, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. And you find Arab were very, like, when they talked, they described things in similarities to animals, like, and because they saw these animals to be absolutely beautiful. They saw beauty in them, and the Prophet ﷺ carried that with him, and it's a part of our deen, really. When you look at it, they saw beauty within all of these animals that they had. Mountains were a big thing, because mountains within Arabia is what you used. I should have added here, stars, but I felt like if I do that, we're going to enter in a whole different. The night sky for the Arabs was what was their their iPad or iPod. It was their phones. They stare. 80% of the stars in the sky are named after our Arabic names. 80%. This is taken from like a study, like an Oxford study. It's not a religious study. Most stars in the sky are Arab names, because the Arab, they're in the desert. So you have this view of the sky that you don't have anywhere else on the planet. It's very few. You don't get a lot of rain, unfortunately. You don't get a lot of clouds. So you see the sky, and you're in the desert. So there's not a lot of light pollution from any source. So you get to really. So they memorized the night sky. They were, and mountains were a part of that. That's how they knew how to navigate. It's where the mountains were, and they named every single mountain has a name. I looked this up to see if it's the same thing in Europe, for example. No, they will call a certain series of mountains. But no, the Arab not only would call the series of mountains, but they would call each and every mountain. They would name them all. And the Prophet ﷺ, we have examples of that, walking and saying, "Hada qazah, wa hada kada, wa hada kada." You call all these mountains. He said, "This mountain." Or how else do we know Uhud? Just called these. We don't know where the origin of the name comes from, but we know that this mountain is called Uhud. The whole Ghazwa is called Uhud because the mountain was called Uhud. We don't know exactly where it came from, but they named every single mountain, and they cared for them. And there's a certain beauty. And the Prophet ﷺ, how else do you go spend 6 months in a cave somewhere? Unless you were very comfortable with mountains and what they brought and the culture that they offered. Bodies of water. The word ma al-Arab or miyah doesn't mean like a water. No, it means like a body of water. And that's how life was. That's why Zamzam was so important. Zamzam gave life. Zamzam made sure that there was going to be life in this area, because how you can't live in the desert if there's not a body of water. And really the fights that the tribes had were over these bodies of water. And if a tribe controlled a body of water, it was way more stable and was able to actually build, they would go from tents to homes because they were to build around these bodies of water. And Yathrib as a city was one of the few cities that existed around Mecca, the actual city, like Ta'if was one too. And the reason is because they had multiple bodies of water and they had wells that they were able to utilize. Where the Prophet ﷺ learned to swim. He learned to swim in an Arabian well in Yathrib, in Medina. That's what he said. That's where I learned to swim. So they had access. If you have an area that has water in it, then you're more likely to be able to be stable. Romance was a big thing. As rigid and as difficult as the Arabian mind was, and as rough as they were, they took a lot of interest in romance and in poetry. Ghazal in the Jahili era and afterwards is a very large portion of poetry. Just talking about their loved ones and who they loved and describing that love and describing. We have like some of the most Antar bin Shaddad, the great poet. He's known not because of his. Obviously, people look up to him or think he's great because of how strong he was in war. But really, it was his love for Abla that cut the deal for him. Like what made him famous were the pieces of poetry he wrote about Abla, about his bint Ammu that he wanted to marry, that they wouldn't give it to him because he was dark skinned and she wasn't, and it took him years to fight his way. He had to literally go to like 5 wars and win them on his own to get his uncle to allow him to marry this lady. So, but this is a big part of their culture. So when we look at them, you're not looking at a group of people that are rough to the point where they don't understand love. This is an important piece. Like when we're talking about a group of people that are very rough and very rigid, their lifestyle, yes, but not to the degree where they don't appreciate the beauty of love. And there are 28 different words to describe love in Arabic, and they are ranked. They are ranked. Don't ask me how I know this, because I'm not proud of that time of my life. But they're ranked from something, and they go up one to the other and each one has a specific meaning of what it does to the person. right? And what it does, and the word ubudiyya, by the way, the word ubudiyya is actually a ranking within the terms of love. Like it's Arab would use ubudiyya as a ranking. Why? Because mu'abbad means your ego has been completely bulldozed. There's nothing left of you. You're so in love that you are willing to let this person walk back and forth on you with there's no ups and downs anymore. You're just completely paved out because you're so in love. And these are just words that they cared for this. And that's an important piece because in my opinion, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose the Arab for this final message, there was a mix that had to be right, and that mix is what I'm trying to get you to see. That there were a lot of mistakes, for sure. I think I've blown that horn enough. Like there's a lot of problems that had to be fixed, but there are also a couple of things there that were important, and this is an example of them. They loved their swords and loved their spears, and they had a connection to their weaponry. And they named them. And for example, Dhul Fiqar is the name of the sword of Sayyidina Ali. And the Prophet ﷺ had a sword, also a number of names that exist within the books of Sirah. So these things are an example of a tent. Every single piece of the tent is named. Every single piece of the tent is named. The piece of fabric at the beginning, and the second piece of fabric, and the third piece of fabric, every single aspect of the tent, the Arabic tent is given a name. This is how, and then they knew these names, and you would find these words in Arabic poetry, and you read it, and then you're like, I don't know what this word means. It's really just a simile that he's drawing to something that they looked at often. This is a picture of one of the mountains of Al-Ahsa, which is a part of middle Saudi Arabia. It's absolutely majestic, and it's a beautiful. Yes, it's lacking the green and what we've been told that the only things are only beautiful if they're green and there's a waterfall. But really, if you go to a desert and you're able to experience the beauty of open land and open sky, it's actually something quite it's quite magnificent. This is when they talk about their wives or they talk about women and they say she looks like a gazelle or looks like a this. This is what they're referring to. This is the type of creature that they're referring to. They're referring something that is quite. They saw beauty in this. They saw beauty in these creatures, and that's why sometimes you read the poetry. It's like, what is he doing? He's calling her. He's making a simile to her and an animal. For example, people get very offended that they'll draw similes between women and cows, right? They're like, oh, that's no. The Arab didn't use it that way. I understand that there's a usage today that's extremely negative, but back then, no, they actually saw beauty and they loved these animals. They absolutely. My grandmother, this is a true story. My grandmother, when she had a Dutch cow, right? She cried when that cow died and mourned that cow more than she did some of her own children and her husband. And people always say, like, you have to khafifi shwaya, and you're making it very difficult. Other people have died and you have not mourned this guy. She loved that animal. Not only did she, but her children did too. Like some of my elderly uncles, they cried the day that she actually passed away. The Arab have this weird connection to their animals, whether they're farm animals or general animals, and they see beauty in between them. And this is just, I'll give you an example of maybe why, like the shape of the eye and the size of the eye and the way that they talk about the eyebrows, they talk about the nose, they talk about the different stripes of colors. They go into extreme detail and they draw all these similes that they find to be beautiful. This is what a camel looks like. We're used to looking at camels and saying that they're absolutely, this is what I've heard, at least from people. Camels, why do you like camels? Camels are beautiful animals. Camels are extremely unique animals. This is an animal that you can ride in race, you can ride in war, and you can drink its milk and you can eat its meat. And you can drink the water that it carries. There's not an animal on earth that does that. Like cows, you can drink its milk and eat its meat, but you're not going to get on a cow and go into war. That's not you can't do that with a bull. So in a horse, you can ride into war, but you're not going to drink its milk or going to eat its meat. But the camel is the beloved of the Arabi. The Arab man, the Arab woman, they love their camels, which is why, from what I told you, now I understand. When they talk about Harb al-Basus, when they fought over a camel, because this is the symbol of their livelihood. This is the symbol of their survival. Their camels were a part of who they were, because this animal will make sure that you live under the worst circumstances imaginable. When you are going to 100% die, this animal will grant you life. It will take care of you and it'll make sure that you make it to wherever you're going, and it will feed you, and it will. They absolutely love these animals, and they saw beauty in the way that they are. Until this day, you have no idea. You have to go to the Khalij and see the annual camel beauty contests. It is $1 billion industry, right? There are fines for bringing in cosmetic surgeons to fill in lips of camels. There is a $200,000 fine if you're caught doing that. I swear to God, wallahi al-azim, look this up if you don't believe me. Meaning the people will bring their camels and they will try to cosmetically, enhance them. And there are certain parameters of beauty for camels. Imagine if you look at a camel, like, I don't care, I don't know it's behind from his face. I've never seen a camel. Don't look at them very, but for them, they have very specific criteria for what is the beauty of the camel. And the lower lip has to be kind of open and down. If it's not naturally that's not beautiful. So they will bring in plastic surgeons to fill in Botox and do things to make it beautiful. And if they catch you, then you're banned and you have to pay a fine. And this is an Amr Malaki. This is coming from the king of Saudi Arabia himself. Like you can't appeal this in court. This is the degree of how I'm not encouraging you to go and do this or care. I'm just trying to explain to you that this is something that continues till today. It's 2,000 years old. They care for it, but there's a reason for it, because this animal is what let them live. There's an example of what we also said Muawiyah. It's a part of it's where the miyah would look like. The ghazal piece, and then the swords and the spears. They cared for these things. The Sayf al-Dimashqi till today is a big deal. You can look up Sayf al-Dimashqi and see what the Damascus sword was like, because the Arab wanted Damascus steel for some reason. I don't know exactly why. They wanted Damascus steel, and they would make their swords look in a certain way. So the Arabic sword has a curve to it, unlike the medieval European swords that are usually just one long thing. No, the curve to it was a little bit similar to maybe some of the swords that exist in Japan. The spears had like 4 or 5 different ways, different kinds, and they were. I didn't find good pictures to describe the heaviness and how big they were, but these are big things. Like some of these spears are the height of a man. So I want you to imagine a man standing, a full-grown man standing beside the spear. That's how long the spear is. It's not something. Anyways, so that's what I wanted to share with you regarding a little bit of the cultural piece. Now, when we talk about what I'm going to share with you today are the story. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Christians of Najran, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Muwahhideen, within Arabia, just so you have a sense. And then next session will be the final session. We will really dive into talking about the Prophet ﷺ's grandfather and father and mother, and kind of how that all came together, and then how he was born ﷺ, and then that will end the series, or the first part of this course, that way. So what's the story of the Christians of Najran? So within Arabia, a number of conversions occurred. Within Arabia, a number of conversions prior to the Prophet ﷺ's birth occurred. Maybe within the 250 years before he was born, Judaism and Christianity were introduced into Arabia, and its popularity varied depending on what part of the country and what type of people it was introduced to, and who introduced it. So Judaism was introduced in a number of places. One of them obviously was Yathrib, the other one was Khaybar, and a number of other spots within Arabia that today, Israel still is trying to claim. Like when you look at what their plan is, and this is not something that they hide. So fortunately, you can go and look at what their 10 or 15 or 100-year plan is in terms of what they want a land that stretches way deeply into the lands of Saudi Arabia today. So they're interested not just in Palestine, they're interested in most of Lebanon and Jordan, most of Syria, parts of Iraq, and it goes way down into the east-western part of Saudi Arabia, and the middle part as well. And a lot of it comes from like where they used to live back then. It's an argument that obviously they don't have claim there, but I'm just saying that this is where where some of these tribes existed. The Christians, they came a little bit later, but when they did, they found their spaces more in the middle part of Saudi Arabia today, and to the eastern and northeastern parts of that, which is interesting because that was farther away from where the Romans were. Like it actually doesn't add up well, because the Byzantine or the Romans were Christian in origin, and yet the Christians in Arabia weren't adjacent to them, or a little bit farther away, and amongst them and between them were a lot of pagans. So it's not clear to me, like historically, and when I read some of these historical records, it's unclear to me how and why Christianity existed in certain places and not in others. But the story of Nasara Najran is important. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ grew up with this story. So the two stories I'm going to share with you over the next 2 sessions are the 2 stories that he grew up listening to. Aside from Harb al-Basus and Harb Dahis al-Ghabra and Yawm Bu'ath and Harb al-Fijar, these wars, these days that the Arab would memorize, he also grew up with some very, very significant stories that, in my opinion, it happened closely before he was born, والسلام, to influence how he would think about things in his life, والسلام. So one of them was the stories of Nasara Najran. And I have put here for you in English, I break down the story. It's a long story, so please feel free in English or in Arabic to read it to understand a little bit more about how it happened, and who it was that who was the people who actually performed the action, and why this all happened. You can figure out certain aspects of this, but. Malik Himyar, the king of Himyar, was someone who we believe at the time was either converted to Judaism or he was at least an ally of the Persian Empire. And he would continuously go after the caravans of the Romans. So this is the part of so there was a war between the king of Abyssinia, who was allied to the Romans, with the Malik Himyar, and this changed a little bit of the demographic because when he beat Malik Himyar and pushed him back, a lot of people converted to Christianity. So now you had two faiths that don't get along. Historically, just so it's clear, Christians and Jews don't get along. They never have. Help Muslims, the Christians and Jews have forever, throughout history, continued to murder each other. Almost all over the planet. And the only time where there was some peace between them is when there was a majority of Muslims and they both lived side by side. What we're seeing today in the world is really not an alliance of Christianity and Judaism. It's just an alliance of money. It's just an imperialistic approach to the world that uses religion sometimes it hides behind it. It needs it needs a target, it needs a dummy, something to go after to make the enemy, which they have conveniently found us to be a good target. We are slowly kind of shifting that image. It's taking, in my opinion, way longer than it should have, because we have, we really, historically, we had a lot of merit historically. Like, I'm not talking about the last 30 or 40 years. I'm not talking in the 1990s or 80s. I'm talking about way before that. We had a lot of merit historically in terms of tolerance, in terms of people from different faiths living with us, having their full chart of rights and not being forced out of their religion or being murdered because they were Muslim. You want to see, you want to see how tolerant the Christian are? Go study the Chronicles of Andalusia. Go read about how we ended there. Go see what happened once the Muslims had no kingdom anymore. See what they did. See what actually occurred to Muslims. The creativity in torturing people is a little bit impressive, honestly. I don't think it's been topped outside of Sijin Sudnaya, honestly, that we've seen recently. So when you look at these things, you learn that so Christians and Jews have not really gotten along historically, at least not in Arabia. And I know that it doesn't exist elsewhere, but you can go look into that on your own. So the story goes is that the king was of one faith, and the Christians of Najran were newly Christian, and they had accepted Islam. Accepted Tawheed, Christianity in its pure form of La ilaha illallah. In this long story that you will find in the books, and I tell this story in every time. I'm not going to go into details of Abdullah ibn Thamir and the kid and how he went up against the king. That piece you can read on your own and get some clarity on if you like. What I think you should understand from this story is just the concept of, I don't know if I put it here. I don't think I put it here. Is and of course, the king who performed the story of Ashab al-Ukhdud in Surah al-Buruj, his name was Dhu Nuwas. And the persecution occurred upon Christian people. So what is the Prophet ﷺ listening to? He's listening to a story of people who made a religious choice and then got persecuted for it. And their religious choice was to refuse a false deity. Like to refuse oppression, to refuse worshiping a person or an idol or of some sort. Like, so the Judaism, whatever version of Judaism Dhu Nuwas was following, was not obviously the one that exists today, something that had some form of paganism in it, or he was claiming something that he didn't get or that was not owed. Regardless of it, the Christians of Najran claimed Tawheed and of course got burnt in a large trench. The story goes that he and you'll find some of these within the stories. Meaning this is historically actually there's a record for it. Like some of the stories that we have within our seerah, it's hard to find chronicles, historical chronicles that exist outside of religious literature to verify. But for this one, it actually is there, which is why I put all these slides. I encourage you to read. But a lot of people were murdered. It was over 10,000 people that were killed on the day of Al-Ukhdud that Surah Al-Buruj talks about. So the Prophet ﷺ did not learn about the story of Al-Ukhdud, the trench, from Surah Al-Buruj. No, they knew about it from before. This is something that they grew up with, because you can't burn that number of people alive and this not make noise. Like this is a story that's going to travel. And it traveled all across Arabia, which is why we have chronicles of it within modern history today, because it's something that had that ripple effect. It was quite horrible. So the story goes that he dug a trench and he filled it with fire, and then these people were brought and asked to leave their deen, and the majority of them did not. So the story goes that maybe there was maybe 20,000 of them, and more than half refused, and those half that or more than half that refused were thrown, breathing and screaming into a fire, and they were burnt alive. To the point where the scent of burning meat made it a couple of 100 kilometers off into the desert where people were smelling a barbecue. This is how many people they actually burnt. So the surah comes and talks about that, right? And the Surah Al-Buruj, he talks about it from the perspective of indifference, of وَشَاهِدٍ وَمَشْهُودٍ وَهُمْ عَلَى مَا يَفْعَلُونَ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ شُهُودٍ. The witnesses, and that which was witnessed, and those who witnessed what happened to the believers. Like it was the third party. Like the surah is interested in talking about the bystanders, or if that's a correct word, I'm not sure. But those who just stood by and watched and didn't actually perform the action, the horrific act of terror that occurred that day. But nor were they on the receiving side. They were more or less the people who didn't agree with it, but did not have the guts to say anything against it. And of course, Al-Buruj came and really zoomed in on that piece and exposed it as a huge problem. So the Prophet ﷺ would grow up listening to the story of Ashab al-Ukhdud. And this became a big part of his identity, as many of people at that time, is because of religious persecution. Because he was going to be carrying this in his life as well. So he started seeing that, no, people should not be forced in or out of any faith. They should be able to believe whatever they wanted, which got him thinking. And he's like, well, if you have to force people to accept a religion, usually that means you're not that confident with the idea of your religion. Like you're scared that your idea is weak, so you need to actually coerce people to accept it, which got him at a young age thinking about, okay, what is it that people are doing? And all these asnam and all that came with it. He started questioning a lot of this stuff. I mean, if in order to get people to believe in asnam, you have to do something like this, you have to burn people alive in the thousands, then there must be a weakness. You must be aware of a crucial central weakness within your argument that you don't want to have to deal with. So see, there's two ways to go by a dispute. Either we argue it logically and then the best idea wins, or whoever's stronger just forces the other person to do what they want. Right? And that works it happens in life in general. In life in general, that's how life. Either you're willing to have a conversation and you can prove that you have a better idea, or you're going to just use your authority and just say, this is what we're doing, whether you like it or not. The Prophet ﷺ, as most of us, as most pure souls, will identify with the idea that may the strongest idea win. Why would we coerce people? So he starts thinking, ﷺ, and that becomes the premise of his discussions with Quraysh later on. Stop getting violent with me. Just come to the table, talk with me. Just talk to me. Listen to my argument, make a better one. If you make a better argument, I will قُلْ إِنْ كَانَ لِلرَّحْمَنِ وَلَدٌ فَأَنَا أَوَّلُ الْعَابِدِينَ. Prove to me that what you're saying is correct, and I will leave what I'm doing. But have a discussion with me. Quraysh refused to have that discussion. They would not sit down for that discussion. Like they wouldn't allow for an appropriate debate or appropriate conversation on this matter to happen. They chose the oppressive way. Similar. So the Prophet ﷺ is seeing the differences. But he already knew about this from the story of the Christians of Najran. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of figures in Arabian history that I think are important for you to know about, just because they'll come up throughout Sirah, and these are people, like what I'm sharing with you today, are things that are in the back of the mind of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. What does he have in his mind? He comes from a culture that loves their animals and loves their wilderness and loves the sky and cares for romance and love and cares for tents and cares for these things, this thing they care about. He's growing up listening to the story of horrific persecution that occurred to people who dared think out of the box or do something that the authorities did not agree with. Another figure that he grew up listening about, alayhi salam, was a man by the name of Hatim al-Ta'i. Yeah, it's all translated for you to. Now Hatim is he is from the tribe of Tayyin, and this is the reason that he's so famous is because he demonstrated a degree of generosity that has not been paralleled since. Like he did things that you just don't do. Like you can be generous, but you don't do that. You don't go that far is considered to be recklessness. Is considered to be lack of wisdom. This is the degree of karam that he would show. And the example that I put for you here, that when it got really cold in the winter, he would make a fire and to make sure someone found him. So he would feed him from whatever food he had. Like he refused to eat alone. So he would make a fire, and he didn't live alone. He had his wife. Hatim al-Ta'i, by the way, did not end a nice ending. Like he died very poor. And he died like very poor. Like it's not like this worked out, but he was committed to this idea. And he would say أوقد الليل فإن الليل قر والريح يا واقد ريح صر على يرى نارك من يمر إن جلبت ضيفا فأنت حر. So he would talk to the fire, and he would say, turn the night into day, and may the wind carry your scent out, so that maybe someone sees you, and if someone sees you, I'll let you be. Like I'll leave you, O fire, to do whatever. Just bring me one person who will share my food with me. And the stories of him slaughtering his own horse and cooking it and leaving nothing in his home just to take care of a daif who came and sat with him. So this was Arabian culture, but he became the epitome of that culture. Like he became the symbol of generosity within that culture. The name that if you ever want to describe someone of generosity or karam, you'll say, karam hatami. Until this day, like generosity that is hatam-like generosity, right? Because he became that. And the Prophet ﷺ obviously grew up with that. And his son, Adi, would become a Muslim years later, but it would be a big problem because it was hard for someone who comes from this extremely high level lineage to change their way, because Adi was the son of Hatim al-Ta'i, who is probably the most famous figure in the history of the peninsula. Like if you were to rank people's reputation or famousness, then he outranks the poets and the kings and the warriors. Hatim al-Ta'i is probably the most famous person that lived in Arabia prior to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Alayhi salatu wasalam is the most famous person who ever lived there, obviously, today. But Hatim was, he ranks number 2 in terms of his famousness and his popularity. And the reason is because of what? Because of a good virtue. Because of a beautiful virtue. Now, maybe the reasoning behind it was maybe it wasn't for the sake of Allah, or maybe there was some degree of ego or some degree of wanting that reputation to live on, regardless of what the reasoning was. It was based on a virtue. I'm just putting pieces of the puzzle for you, so you understand the mentality of Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam. He's growing up. This is what he's seeing. This is what he's hearing, right? So you can, because this little, I find it hard to use some of these wording, so forgive me if it doesn't come off. I want you to imagine Muhammad alayhi salam, the boy, right? As a little boy, who grew up and his father's not there. His father died, right? As we're going to talk about next week, in some degree of depth. And he's growing up in and he's a bright little kid who's listening, and he's hearing these stories, and he's hearing about these people, and he's connecting dots. He's connecting dots of virtue and principle, and he's connecting dots, and he's learning about something that's called religious freedom, and what it means for you to have your liberty, and to be able to speak your mind, and to be able to do what you believe is correct, whether people agree with it or not. This is a big part of his upbringing. Another person that I think is worthy of you knowing is the man by the name of Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira. And he is al-Makhzumi. So he is from one of the smaller tribes of Quraysh. So remember when I showed you that diagram that none of you liked? And the diagram within it, there's all these different butun, like all these different lineages coming from Fihr or from Qusay. So Makhzum was not a big one. Makhzum was not, Abu Jahl comes from that one, but it's not a huge tribe. But there were a tribe that had big names. They weren't large in numbers. They were like Al-Aus when you go to Yathrib. Yathrib is like 80% Khazraj and 20% Aus. That's the breakdown. But Aus just had big names, like very big names, had heroes and businessmen and people of great status. The numbers were equal to the numbers of Al-Khazraj, so they continued to be able to push back and stand up to them. Same thing for Banu Makhzum. Their numbers were not as much as Banu Hashim, but they had a lot of big names amongst them. And Al-Walid ibn Mughira was probably the biggest of them all. And he was not only the biggest of Bani Makhzum, he was probably the biggest name of his time within Quraysh in total. Like in Quraysh, during his life, he was probably the ticket ended with him. Like if you needed something done, or if you wanted a decision to be made, then you go and you speak to Al-Walid, who is the father of Khalid ibn al-Walid. So you can imagine that these guys, if you look at it, so look at these two examples, right? So the son of Hatam Adi and the son of Walid Khalid, did they accept Islam early? Not early, no. They accepted late, right? Because it's hard. It was hard for them to break off from the culture of their fathers and go into something new because they came from such status. They came from a family and a lineage and a background of such fame and status and respect that was very hard. So Walid is the uncle, the paternal uncle of Abu Jahl, right? So Abu Jahl, his name is Abu al-Hakam ibn Hisham ibn al-Mughira. So Al-Walid and Hisham are brothers, sons of Mughira, and Hisham's son is Abu al-Hakam, right? Or Amr, his name is Amr ibn Hisham. So Abu Jahl, his uncle is Al-Walid. So you understand where Abu Jahl is, because Al-Walid al-Mughira was he's the guy who, he's a Wathani, so he was someone who was fully pagan. A lot of these big names were not necessarily pagans. They didn't necessarily arrive at Tawheed. I'll point out the muwahideen to you, but they were, many of them were not, they didn't believe in paganism, but they didn't have anything, they didn't have an alternative. No, Al-Walid al-Mughira was a big pagan, and he believed in that stuff, and he cared for it, and he's one of the people who strengthened the whole the stronghold of paganism and shirk and wathaniya within Mecca at the time. And he was amongst the chiefs of not just Quraysh, but the chiefs of Arabia, one of the great hukama, one of the great wise men. I didn't put him in the name there because I'm going to talk about him specifically. So he's one of the hukama, meaning people came from far and wide to take his judgment on anything. And he is someone who has a lot of fame in terms of war. He was a commander of multiple great days of war in his and he is someone who had some degree of ethical standard, and it was known that he didn't drink alcohol. Harram al-khamr, like he refused khamr all throughout his life. And he is the person who, once Kaaba fell, the story that we tell like maybe next semester or the semester after, when the Kaaba fell and they needed to rebuild it again, was the person who had the guts to actually, take the first whack at the Kaaba, because no one else dared touch it. The last person who did that, his name was Abraha, and things didn't go very well for him or anyone with him. So they were very scared of it. But because he had that, he was seen as the leader. So he was always going to take that. And one of the things that he did, I'm not sure if I put this here now, is that he told the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he told this to him during his life, and during his prophecy, that if Allah was going to choose a prophet, then why would He choose you and I'm here? Like, why would He choose you and I'm alive? It doesn't make any sense. Like, no offense to you, obviously, a lot of offense to you, but that's And usually, whenever someone says all due respect, know that whatever comes next has no respect in it at all. Like, it's just, these cues that we use as human beings is very bothering. Just come out and say what you want, and none of this. So he would tell the Prophet, وَقَالُوا لَوْلَا نُزِّلَ هَذَا الْقُرْآنُ عَلَى رَجُلٍ من القريتين عظيم, referring to Walid al-Mughira and one of the sons of Ibn Abdi Alayl of Ta'if in Thaqif. And some of them say that it's Utbah ibn Rabi'a within Quraysh, but we know it's Al-Walid for sure. And Al-Walid, to make this even more clear to you, he is the one who set the narrative. What do I mean by that? Meaning, once Islam became a problem for Quraysh, like they couldn't just ignore it, they needed to have a narrative. Like, what do we call this? So it's described in depth in Surah Al-Muddathir, right? إنه فكر وقدر فقتل كيف قدر ثم قتل كيف قدر ثم نظر ثم عبس وبسر ثم أدبر واستكبر فقال إن هذا إلا سحر يؤثر. So this is sorcery that he inherited from a source that we're not aware of. That's the narrative. He's not a sorcerer, because we say that doesn't work. He's not a poet. We can't say that. He's not this. He's not. So we're going to say that what he has is a form of magic or sorcery, and it's not homemade. He didn't make it. He can't take credit for it. He got it from a source that is foreign to Arabia. So he made a nice mix. He gave him something that took away the power of his words, and he made sure that was imported. So he took away any authenticity. So that was a narrative that he put out, and he was the person who made that that narrative. And the story that I'll tell you inshallah later on in this. But this is who Walid al-Mughira was, and he was the head of the Quraysh council or parliament. Dar al-Nadwa, he ran it. He was responsible for Dar al-Nadwa. He was the head of it. So he's the chairman of the Quraysh board, for lack of another way of putting it. All right. Another extremely important figure here is Abu Sufyan Sakhr ibn Harb. So his name is Sakhr ibn Harb ibn Umayyah ibn Abd Shams. So Umayyah ibn Abd Shams, if you go back, he's the guy who put up a fight with his uncle Hashim ibn Abd Manaf. Right? He's the guy who tried to take away, and he ended up being sent in exile for 10 years. Right? His son Harb ibn Umayyah is the guy who led the Quraysh army in Harb al-Fijar. In Harb al-Fijar, and he fought well, but he was also taken by Thuqif and he was humiliated and then killed. So his son Sakhr was named Boulder, literally that's his name, Sakhr ibn Harb. His father's name is War and his name is Boulder. So you can imagine the demeanor of this gentleman. So he grew up with the story of a father who was a famous chief, a hero that was killed by the enemy, and a grandfather that was mistreated by his uncle. And by his uncle Hashim. So he grows up with a specific grudge against the people who allowed his father to be captured and against the family that makes sure removed his grandfather. So Abu Sufyan, so Abu Sufyan, and he's obviously the father of again the same trend of Muawiyah, right? Did Muawiyah accept Islam early? No, Muawiyah also accepted Islam quite late. He accepts Islam quite late, and he's a very, very controversial figure within our Islamic background. It's funny enough, Muawiyah is more controversial than his father is. Even though Abu Sufyan, Sakhr ibn Harb would be, he would be literally the person who pushed against the Prophet ﷺ the most in his life, in terms of longevity. Talk about how many years. Abu Jahl died in Badr. He didn't live long enough. And Walid Mughira died as well early. He was an old man. But Abu Sufyan, no, he lived way. He outlived the Prophet. He was 10 years older than the Prophet ﷺ. He outlived him by another maybe 20 years. So he lived well into his 90s, and he died في المعركة. Like he died like within war, within معركة اليرموك or others معارك. He died رضي الله عنه fighting. And he was a known businessman who took on, like he was the finance man. And he went with the business, he took all the wealth of the wealthy of Quraysh. So when people who were wealthy wanted to put their money, like wanted to invest with someone that the rich people invested, Abu Sufyan took the caravan there and took it back. And his caravans were huge and they were well supported as well. And he was in war, because Walid al-Mughira got old, Abu Sufyan became the next in command. And he became the person as far as armies go. Abu Jahl became the political leader, not the military one. The military leader was always Abu Sufyan. Like so, when we talk about Badr, we talk about Uhud, we talk about Khandaq. All three of them was Abu Sufyan, Sakhr ibn Harb. And they would say, there's a saying that أفضل قريش رأيا في الجاهلية ثلاثة عتبة وأبو جهل وأبو سفيان. They didn't say it that way. They would say عتبة وعمر وصخر. So عتبة is عتبة bin Rabi'ah, and I didn't give him his own introduction. I'll talk to him. We'll talk about him later. He doesn't need a very long one. And Abu Jahl was Amr ibn Hisham, and then Abu Sufyan, Sakhr ibn Harb. These three people were known to be the wisest of Quraysh. The wisest of Quraysh. So they were very capable human beings. What I'm trying to explain to you is that the Prophet ﷺ wasn't up against a bunch of garbagey people. No, he was up against the wisest of the men, and the ones who they have merit, they have accolade, they have a history. People trust them. People look up to them. They're the ones who lead us in war. They're the ones who negotiate on our behalf. They're the ones who take care of our wealth. They're the ones who make the decisions for us. And there are people who are hukama, who are wise, who Arabia respects us because we have them in our ranks. So the Prophet ﷺ is coming saying Tawheed, and they're three saying no. What do you think Quraysh is going to do? What do you think the people are going to do? Muhammad sallallahu lived a life of selflessness. We're going to talk about this next semester. He chose. You say, well, why didn't he? If Abu Sufyan is only 10 years older, and Abu Jahl, Amr ibn Hisham, is technically almost his age, well, why are these guys leading everything? And the Prophet ﷺ does not exist in that reg. He chose to live a different type of life. He chose to be someone in the trenches, on the ground, working with people who had nothing. Like he chose to live that way, He chose for his legacy to be a legacy of empathy and caring about other people. He never had interest in being in Dar al-Nadwa. He couldn't care less about that. He couldn't care less about politics. It wasn't his thing. He was focused on a whole different way of living. So it's really important to understand that he was up against people that were extremely well respected and very well established for good reason. The more you understand this piece, the more you're able to logically deal with the siyam. If you demonize your enemy, then you learn nothing. You learn nothing. If you make your enemy to be absolutely a complete failure, wrong in every way, shaitan, just in the form of a human being, then you learn nothing. You can't grow. You will not adjust your own. You will turn into that which you called him. You will turn into that which you called him. 100%. The moment you demonize, the moment you look at the opposite and say everything is wrong, they're a shar, they deserve to be removed and killed, oh, then you turn into that. You turn into exactly the thing that you don't like. See, when you look at him, alayhi salatu wasalam, they were his enemies, but he made dua for them every day. And he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive them. He asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide them. And every time he had the slightest opportunity to guide them, he did, even after in war, after war, regardless, because his goal here, because he could see the khair in them, like there's good in you. Like he would make the dua, alayhi salatu, Allahumma a'izz al-Islam bi ahad al-umarain. Grant us strength with one of the two Umars, either Umar ibn Khattab or Amr ibn Hisham, Abu Jahl, because he could see that there's goodness in this person. This person can't get over themselves or can't get over a certain aspect of their own background or ego or upbringing. So they're stuck within their own minds. He could see that there's goodness if they can do that, and he cared for that. He would say, and nas ma'ad, people are, they have an innate substance, or they have true colors deep inside. خيارهم في الجاهلية خيارهم في, the best in Jahiliyyah, the best in Islam. إذا فقهوا, they learn, and if they commit themselves, they'll be the best. And we know that because those who did, and then some of them didn't. And I'm giving you the names of some of them. Abu Sufyan Sakhr ibn Harb, it took him a long time. He came around eventually, but not early enough to affect the story in a way that we can credit to him. Radiallahu anhu anyways, obviously. His wife is Hind bint Utbah ibn Rabi'ah. So Utbah ibn Rabi'ah is one of the wisest men of Arabia. His daughter Hind is married to Abu Sufyan. So it's a very close-knit group of people. The elite of Quraysh were truly elite. They were elite in terms of their lineage. They were elite in terms of their wealth. They were elite in terms of their reputation within Arabia and their authority and status. So they were truly elite. And then everyone else was just, they were, it wasn't the same. All right. The last person, Abu al-Hakam ibn Hisham, Amr ibn Hisham ibn al-Mughira al-Makhzumi. So he's also one of the min Sadati Quraysh. And his name was Abu al-Hakam. Al-Hakam is a judge. Abu al-Hakam it was a nickname given to him because he did a lot of that. People came to him, and he functioned as a judge, as a hakam. So he would always be taking care of disputes or giving rulings. And the Prophet ﷺ finally called him Abu Jahl. Like once he was by the way, he wasn't called Abu Jahl like in Mecca. He was called Abu Jahl after he went to Medina, alayhi salam. So not like we use that. I say Abu Jahl said this, Abu Jahl said that. No, this didn't happen like early on. He called him. This is the name that he was given. Most scholars say it was given after he died. I think most scholars of the Prophet use this way this phrase to describe him after he died, because to him it's his ignorance. How could you? Why? This didn't have to happen. You didn't have to be lying there dead in Badr. You could have been on my, why? Hakam, you're not Hakam, you're Jahl. This is your ignorance that allowed you to do this. So this is his frustration, alayhi salatu wasalam, is the way he saw people. He didn't see, it's important that you can look at these people and feel for them within the story. And then you can actually start learning and saying, because then you can start saying, well, I don't know, maybe I would have done that too. That's how you learn. That's how you start growing. Because I probably would have done that. If I tell you the story in a way where it makes no sense, where Utbah and Abu Sufyan and Abu Jahl and all these people are acting like complete douche, that there's no brain function at all, everything is wrong, it makes no sense whatsoever, then you're like, yes, kill it. No. These are very, very intelligent people. They are wealthy, they are respected, they are brave, and they have a certain degree, they have a standard of ethics. But they made mistakes that I can make too. So I can learn from these mistakes, so I don't make them, or else I'm not going to learn anything. And this is our biggest problem when we read the Quran. We don't learn. When Allah talks about the Yahud, wal Nasara, wal Mushrikeen, wal Mujrimeen, wa Qawm Lut, wa Qawm Kata, we don't learn anything. You say, look at this horrible group of people. Alaykum kulhum. You don't learn anything that way. You don't learn. Do you know where you would be standing if you were back then with him, alayhi salatu? Do you know? Do you know where you would be? If you grew up with him, alayhi salatu, and he came and said, La ilaha illallah, what are the odds that you would go join him? Do you understand how low those odds are? You ever thought about that? You understand how low the odds are? You don't think about that. No, I would totally get it. Really? You know this. Once there's a hadith in Bukhari. I share this hadith every once in a while, where Miqdad al-Aswad is sitting. It's in Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim as well. And Miqdad al-Aswad is one of the known Sahaba. And a man came to him and said this, قال هنيئا لعينين رأتا رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام. And beautiful eyes saw the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام. He got angry. So the guy beside him, one of his students, قال يا أبا عبد الرحمن ما قال إلا خيرا. He only said something nice. قال ما بال أحدكم يطلب محضرا غيبه الله عنه هل لا شكرتم ربكم أنكم خرجتم للدنيا لا تعرفون إلا ربكم. Why are you asking about something that Allah did not put you in, acting as if you knew what you would have done that time? Could you not just be happy to say Alhamdulillah that I grew up knowing no one but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فإني أعرف أناسا نظروا بأعينهم إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كبهم الله في وجوههم إلى النار. I know a lot of people who looked at with their eyes at the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام and they ended up in Jahannam. And then he goes on this long rant. Like it's a long hadith where he just talks and he humbles everybody, including me. And you listen to this, oh, okay, maybe I should shut up. Maybe I should learn. Because I don't know what I would have done back then. If someone like Abu al-Hakam or Abu Sufyan didn't accept Islam, actually, I am very worried. I'm very worried about my odds. These are people who have like a list of achievements within their 30s that I can't even dream of. Leading an army in battle, being so famous of wisdom that people come to me to ask for this. What are you talking about? My kids, what are you doing? Like I'm the only doctor in the family. No one ever asked me if this is a good thing to take. There's no care for this. It's very difficult to achieve what one of these people have achieved. One of them, and they didn't accept Islam. This is the point of me telling you all this, is that when you read the story of the Prophet ﷺ, you appreciate it more. And you appreciate what he did, and you appreciate the weakness that we carry inside so that we can learn from it, so that we don't allow ourselves to be that in our lives. We're just as arrogant as they are. All right, I think that's the end of what I wanted to say here. I put down a little bit of breakdown of who he was. He was he was a very, very famous person. He was probably the most famous judge within Mecca. He was the political leader of Quraysh at the time. And father of wisdom, Abu al-Hakam, the father of wisdom. That's what he was called. That's how famous this guy is. So these are the monotheists of Arabia. I was supposed to get through all of them today, which I'm not going to, because it's all 56. So I'm going to actually leave you to read some of these things. So these are the names of the people who were muwahideen in Arabia before the Prophet ﷺ came to. So Khalid ibn Sinan al-Absi. There's actually this is maqam. They call it maqam Sidi Khalid somewhere in I think it's Morocco, if I'm not where he did travels and he passed away somewhere far from Arabia because he didn't want to stay in a place where it was where there was paganism. So you can read a little bit more about Iran. Sorry, he's buried in Iran, not in Morocco. But you can go see that he has a little place there. This is a muwahhid that existed before the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Hashim ibn Abd Manaf. So the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, great grandfather. The majority opinion that exists within the books of Sirah is that he was one of the muwahhideen in Arabia. He did not believe in. He refused al-Asnam altogether. Umayyah ibn Abi Salt was a very, very known poet. I think I put breaks down for all of these people. So you can go and read about them if you want to know a little bit more about these individuals. Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl. Now, Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl is very important. He's an important figure because Zayd is the father of, so you know that 10 Mubashirin bil Jannah? So if I ask you to count them, you count 9 for me, and then you would sit there staring at me because you don't got to say. The number 10 is always Sa'id ibn Zayd. No one remembers him. But his name is Sa'id ibn Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl. He is Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl's son. So, subhanAllah, the barakah of what his father did, this is the وَكَانَ أَبُوهُمَا صَالِحًا type of what his father did. And the Prophet ﷺ would talk about Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl and would say, يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ يُحْشَرُ أُمَّةً وَحْدًا. He comes alone as his own ummah on that day because he's one of the few people who stood by true monotheism, the Hanifiyya of Ibrahim. He called to the Hanifiyya Ibrahim, and he actually taught the Prophet ﷺ one or two things when he was young. Meaning the Prophet ﷺ was going to a banquet with some people, and Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl was someone the Prophet ﷺ saw, and he was a very respected individual, known to be a bit of a rebel, known to be someone who was a little bit of an outcast because he doesn't accept certain things, and he refused to eat. So the Prophet ﷺ had his friend ask him, like he didn't want to ask him directly, so had the friend ask him, فَقَالَ هَذَا طَعَامٌ يُقَدَّمُ لِلْأَوْثَانِ فَإِنِّي لَا أَكُلُ مَا تَطْبُخُونَ لِلْأَصْنَامِ. This is food that's going to be offered as offerings to the idols. I don't eat that. قال فامتنع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. The Prophet said, no, then I won't do it either. Because the Prophet inheritedly did not like paganism. He didn't believe in idolatry at all. And Zayd was someone who has a couple of stories within his life that kind of helped him see certain things. Right? I've told these stories before, and it's funny once I told a story similar to this, and someone came and said, and someone felt that it caused them doubt in the Prophet. Explain to me why. So well, that means he got this idea from someone else. Hanifiyya was not a new idea. Hanifiya was Ibrahim alayhi salam brought. There were still people in Arabia who were Adnanites who believe, and even Qahtanites who still believed in Tawheed. And actually, the Prophet ﷺ being in touch with them makes a lot of sense, and actually strengthens the story that he was seeing. He was given this idea was there. He didn't understand it fully. He knew that this idea was attractive. He just couldn't figure out why and why this is why he would go and contemplate for months and upon months trying to figure out what to do. We today, like you and I, we can say, well, we don't need to do because you have the Quran, Habibi. You grew up with the Quran, and you know all of these things, these stories have been told to you, so you have this strength. This to him, alayhi salam, what does he have? He has what I've told you over the last 7 sessions. That's what he grew up with. He grows up with this lineage. He grows up with the poetry. He grows up. This is what he's growing up. The stories of you and I have a different experience of life. So really, if you're going to learn about the Prophet ﷺ, you have to put yourself in his position, right? And understand that what his experiences were. I did this. It's absolutely beautiful. It's the best thing you'll ever do. If you can figure out how to do it, it's very hard because it's not easy to kind of get rid of kind of pick up the cultural baggage that you carry and put it aside and zone yourself into some kid who's going to grow up in the 7th century Arabia with these stories and this culture and this background and these people that are, but when you can, then you start really appreciating the genius of Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. You see him as the intellectual that he was, as the rebel that he was, as the man of deep thought and philosophy and ethics that he was alayhi salatu wasalam, and it's just beautiful. Waraq bin Nawfal, which is a well-known individual, obviously he's going to play a big role in the Prophet ﷺ's early prophecy, and he's related closely to Khadija bint Khuwaylid, and I'll talk about him a little bit more. I'm sorry, I want to talk about these people a bit more. Qas ibn Sa'ida, the known orator of Arabia, was a muwahhid, so a lot of his orations have tawheed within them. But Quraysh or the people, the Arab, would listen to him and ignore the Tawheed part and take the rest of it from him, but not the Tawheed part. And Abu Amr ibn Sayfi. So I have to talk about him and Suwayd ibn Samit. Did I put him twice? No, I didn't. So where's... okay, so Abu Amr ibn Sayfi. Oh, we actually finished. Perfect. Yes. It doesn't matter. It's all in Arabic. No one's going to read anything. I'll tell the story. It doesn't matter. So Abu Amr al-Sayfi ibn Sayfi, he was someone. It's important story because he was a rahib. He was a Christian priest, right? And his story is talked about within Usd al-Ghaba for Ibn Hajar, and also in the collection, the Tafsir al-Qurtubi. So you have like this long kind of breakdown of it. And he claimed to be a part of the Hanifiyya of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he would wear differently than the Arab would, and he would pray differently than the Arab would. And he went to he had a lot of trips to Damascus or close around to learn. And when the Prophet ﷺ brought prophecy, he was heartbroken because he felt that it should have been him, because he had put in all the effort beforehand. So he refused to accept the Prophet ﷺ altogether. And he told, Amat Allahu al-kadhiba minna taridan wahida. May the person lying amongst us die alone and lonely, and isolated. And that's how he died. Abu Amr al-Rahab, that's how he died. And the Prophet ﷺ performed like this long chronicles of da'wah. The Prophet ﷺ talking to him, read, and he couldn't get over it. He couldn't get over the fact that he wasn't chosen for this. And that's how, and he was called Abu Amr al-Fasiq, and he's the guy who dug the hole that he fell in on the day of Uhud alayhi salatu wasalam. He's the guy who dug the hole, right? So that he went beyond, he built Masjid Dirar. In the Masjid al-Dirara, he's the guy who built it, because he was trying to the best of his ability to ruin whatever the Prophet ﷺ was doing, or to get some degree of fame for himself. And he went a number of times to Qaisar, to Herakl, asking for an army to demolish the Muslims. He tried and he failed. He couldn't convince Herakl, because interestingly enough, Abu Sufyan had gone before and unintentionally gave a great description of the Prophet ﷺ to Herakl. Herakl was like, I'm good with him. I don't want to touch him. I'll never touch him. So the time Abu Amr al-Rahib came to actually get the army, he was like, no, you're a guy who's more famous than you, Sakhr ibn Haram, who we know better, and gave me a different, he's not believing, but he gave me a different, this is subhanAllah, the tartib of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the Prophet ﷺ to exist. So Abu Amr ibn Sayf is a sad story, in my opinion. And he harmed the Prophet ﷺ, and may Allah punish him for that, because but you understand where it came from. He had a problem. He saw things. He felt like there was something that was missing for him. And a lot of these stories. And he was a very close friend, by the way, to Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul. He was a very, very close friend. Like they were very, very close. And Abdullah ibn Ubay Salul, I talked to you about, he's one of the leaders of Al-Khazraj, but he's also someone who was almost going to be made king of Medina. So the Prophet ﷺ comes to Yathrib, a guy who felt he should have been prophet and a guy who felt he would be king, now lost both prophecy and kingship. And now the one person, and they couldn't get over that throughout their lives. Which is why you understand why the Prophet ﷺ was so merciful to these people. Like he never made them his enemies. Salla ala Abdullah ibn Salul. And he didn't he never made dua against Abu Amr al-Rahib. Like they make dua against him. He dug the hole, he didn't do it, alayhi salatu wasalam, he refused to. Because he understood where their struggle came from. See, that humanizing of the other is really what I'm trying to help you understand. Because we always look at Abu Jahl, he was Abu Jahl to us, but he wasn't that wasn't his story to begin with. I'll end with telling you, this. It's just something for you to contemplate, and I'm not. I don't defend obviously those who make wrong mistakes and those who openly defy the truth and justice. No, we never defend them. We understand. We can learn from where they're coming from, so that we can avoid that mistake ourselves. I'm not trying to defend it, but there's a nice little quote that you can maybe toy with tonight when you go home. How do you define a villain? How do you define a villain? He's just a hero whose story hasn't been told. Right? Just someone whose story hasn't been told. See, when you listen to someone's full story, not the story of their enemy, you understand, okay, all right. Okay, I understand where this is coming from. The beauty of our deen is that there are certain points where we say that was wrong. Yes, I empathize with this, I empathize with that, but that was wrong. And that mistake is what put you where you are. And then that mistake, which you can see yourself making, you make sure you don't make. You make sure that you don't make. So that's how you learn. Instead of just calling, because we grow up, you have Batman and you have the Joker, and then it's always, well, maybe it's not that clear cut. Maybe it's not like that. Maybe it's not that this person is innately evil and this person is innately good. Maybe it's just there's a mix, and then you have at certain points, very subtly, you'll make choices. And one of those choices will be either the choice that will save you or the choice that will damn you. And learning that from studying these people and studying how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with them, and understand, you understand more why he was merciful. It wasn't just like free. It wasn't just for no reason. No, he understood where people were coming from. He understood how this sometimes is going to be difficult for you to give up this legacy, to give up this background, to give up this grudge, to give up this animosity, to accept that this is not going to be you. These things are human things, humane. We all struggle with these things. And that's how we learn. That's how we learn from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. That's why I'm teaching it this way, because I think it's important that you have this background. Your experience of the seerah will be different from others. I can't make this background every time I tell the stories for kids. And I'm not interested in that. I want them to build an identity and be impressed by the bravery of the Sahaba and the beauty of what the Prophet ﷺ did. But for someone who's a bit more older and mature and their identity is set, now really look into this and understand where the problems were, and you'll grow from that. So end with that, inshallah. Subhanaka bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullahu khairan. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.